Okay, this video we're going to be doing the stuff for task sheet 247. So a few things we need to cover here. So this truck has dual rear axles, drive axles. So it has what is called a slipper saddle, which means that where the leaf spring comes up and connects to the component, this is just like a saddle in here that allows us to slide back and forth. Now you have leaf springs like this truck that have a slipper saddle on each end. Okay. This is really common in our big trucks with two drive axles on the back. Our front axle, same thing, we've got a slipper here and a slipper up here on the front. Okay, and I'll explain a little more what that means here in just a minute. So with this truck having a slipper saddle on each end of it, as the suspension works, so in other words the frame drops with weight applied or you encounter a bump and things have to move, this leaf spring is going to change in length because it's an arc. Right, so as it moves up and down, the length of it from end to end is going to change as the suspension works, either holding more weight up, being added to the truck, or negotiating bumps and whatnot. So if we have this slipper saddle on each end, we have to have what is called a radius rod or radius arm. You can also hear it called a torque arm and a dog bone, because each end of it is round and gets bigger. So if you looked at it from the side, I guess someone could kind of think it looked like a bone, because an image of a bone generally has a place for a joint on each end where it gets bigger. So that's a slang term, somebody calling it a dog bone because it's kind of the shape of it. Okay, so what keeps this axle in place on the frame to keep it from moving forward and backward, since it has a slipper saddle at each end, is this torque arm or radius rod. Okay, so it's attached back on the back to the axle beneath the leaf spring, and on the front it's attached to a bracket that is bolted to the frame. So this rod keeps the axle from moving forward and backward on the truck. It has rubber bushings in each end of it. Those rubber bushings can get bad, so you need to get a big pry bar, get the weight unloaded, they call it, from the truck. So to check these, you would probably want to jack the truck up, maybe support it from the frame, let the axle hang, and use a pry bar to pry. But normally you can look at the bushings and tell if they're in bad shape, dry rotted, excessive cracks like these. Chunks missing would be bad. Any movement that you can really feel is bad. I mean, it's going to move a little bit and have some give to it, but there's a specification on how much that it can move. If you're doing the inspection on the rear suspension on this truck, you would notice that this pin right here is gone. It's supposed to have a pin with a cotter pin in there, so that may be one of the things you would check doing your inspection of the components for this rear axle setup. But you'd look all the way around on that, look at all the fasteners, make sure they're tight, nothing's loose. We'll go through some leaf spring components next in the next video. 248 talks about a tandem suspension equalizer and determine needed action. So this is a tandem suspension. Okay, both these axles are connected with a little equalizer in the middle. You see this on trailers as well. So there's a big rubber bushing that goes here in the middle around this bolt, and then this equalizer piece, both of those are connected in the middle around that bushing. So that equalizer does this when you encounter bumps. Okay, if the front one comes up, the back one comes down, and vice versa. So they kind of equalize and share the bumps and suspension stuff between the two axles. So that's what it's talking about with an equalizer. Now there's an equalizer beam suspension. Don't get those confused. We'll talk about it later. I have a truck with that on it, but there's not a whole lot of those out there, but there are some. So the equalizer beam is different than just a dual suspension equalizer like what we have here. So once again, you want to pry on this, and there's an amount of movement that this rubber bushing can have. In other words, this equalizer can have. It's tight on this truck, so I don't have hardly any miles on it, so it's good, but I want you to list the specifications on that. Okay. Move to a different truck here and show you something. If you didn't have dual rear suspension, just a single axle, get this thing to adjust here. Where it is different is it has an eye on one end, so the leaf spring comes up and wraps around and has a bushing inside it, and then it has what's called a shackle here. Okay. The other end of this leaf spring has an eye on it as well, so this is a double eye leaf spring. You see this some vehicles, it won't ever be on a dual rear suspension, but single axle. So remember, we said this leaf spring has to change in length as the suspension works. So one end of this either has to have a slipper saddle and an eye on one end, and this eye right here has a metal bracket connected to the frame, so this is what controls the axle from moving too far back or forward and keeps it straight, is this. But since the leaf spring has to change, it has a shackle on this end, so if it's talking about inspecting a shackle, it's a connector from the frame to the leaf spring with two pivots on it with rubber bushings so that this leaf spring can change in length. There's another setup, which is what a lot of the front axles, or not actually, rear axles on other trucks can have. Front axle is almost always going to have the two eyes like this with a shackle. There are some leaf springs that have an eye on the front end to locate the axle and not let it move forward and backward on the truck, and have a slipper saddle on the back side of it. So that's the three. There's the double eye, the single eye with one slipper, and then there's a slipper axle on each end.